60 Great Ghost Stories, read by H. Washington Sawyer. Tonight's story, The Wolf Book, by Henry Chapman, Mercer. 1. The once celebrated Slavic manuscript, known as the Wolf Book, lost to science soon after its discovery about the middle of the last century, has always been associated with the name of the late Professor C. Nevertheless, the great scholar was invariably reticent on the subject, whether from unwillingness to figure as a hero in his own anecdotes, or distaste for publicity. He for a long time declined to admit that he had discovered the treasure, much less discuss with his friends the scarcely credible experiences that had put him in its possession. These are now, at least, made public, prematurely perhaps, since his own posthumous notes on facts of the case remain to be published. It was in the summer following the Hungarian insurrection of 18 that Professor, putting to test a plausible theory, undertook his long-planned search for classic manuscripts supposedly forgotten or misplaced in the monastic archives of Hungary and Serbia. His clever plan led him to descend the Danube in a houseboat, thereby curtailing land travel and book transport by easy access to libraries from his floating headquarters. But by the time he had neared the celebrated defile by which the great river breaks through the Carpathians, he realized that he had misjudged the situation. Disappointing stories, told him by monks of robberies, fires, books given away or sold, gross carelessness, dull indifference, met him everywhere, until, disgusted by his summer's work, he had concluded to end it. Then, at the 11th hour, fortune smiled upon him at the monastery of Yaloch, overlooking an enchanting valley where, through grain fields and vineyards, the river El takes its great bend to the southward, and peasants wash its sands for gold. The historic Yaloch might well have roused his hopes earlier in the summer, but he saw nothing to cheer his dampened spirits in the bold steeples and century-marking shifts of roof and turret, when, on the morning of a hot summer's day, after a night spent in the neighboring village, he rode up under the lime trees to the great door and rang the bell. His letters of introduction soon brought the usual welcome from the hospitable monks, ending in an interview with the abbot, a small, stooping, white-bearded priest with glittering black eyes, who met him in the fragrant garden. After listening politely to the traveler's brief explanation, and protesting that the library upstairs was not worth seeing, the polite old man led his visitors by way of several vaulted staircases to the end of a whitewashed flagged corridor in one of the upper gables. There he stopped before a large unpainted door, chalk-marked with fading symbols, unlocked it with difficulty, and pushed it open. "I am ashamed to show you such a place," he said. The dilapidated room, commanding a vast view over the great bend of the river, was lighted by two very high broken windows, through which the protruding boughs of an ash tree scratched and rattled in the wind. Save for a few cheap-looking modern books, the rotting doorless cupboards were all empty. Withered leaves of past autumns scattered the floor, and half-buried a lot of dark leather rolls stacked in one corner. The professor stepped forward. "Here's something," he remarked, as, leaning down, he brushed away some leaves. The priest laughed contemptuously. "Only our old farm ledgers," he said, approaching the rubbish and stirring it with his foot. "For you, utterly uninteresting. For us, not worth shelf room." He pulled out one of the cylinders, undid the thongs, and unrolled it about a foot, pointing out rough blocks of coarse manuscript, with here and there a large floriated initial letter in black. Then he tied it up again and tossed it back among the leaves. "Farm ledgers without the farms," he said sadly. "Our lands are gone, and so are our books. You should have come here 100 years ago, before they were stolen." Rather out of politeness than interest in the kind of tale he had listened to so often, the professor asked for particulars. "It came of a lawsuit," explained the priest, "ending in an outrage. You have no doubt heard of the celebrated Baron Trenck the Pandour." "Yes." "A terrible man. History tells us, you know, that the law meant nothing to him, yet his lawsuit with us, which began with his grandfather, was decidedly against us. There was a delay in the matter. The story goes that Trenck, who, in spite of his well-known avarice, was said to be highly educated, agreed to take a certain book out of the library, in part payment of his claim. If so, the book must have been, as they say, either bound in gems and gold, or very valuable. However that may be, during the proceedings, and before the matter was finally settled, our abbot died, and when Trenck came to claim his volume, it could not be found. The thing occurred a long time ago, and it seems almost incredible that a book like this could have been mislaid, or, if hidden, that anyone could have dared to thwart such a man. But so it happened. The result was that might have been expected. At first Trenck ordered his Pandours to burn the monastery, but finally compromised by carrying off the whole library. Everything that we had was packed up in wagons, which he forced the peasants to supply, and off it went." "You had no redress?" asked the professor. "The Empress Maria," continued the priest, "on complaint by our patriarch, ordered Trenck to restore the books. Of course, he pretended to comply, but, of course, evaded the matter in his usual way. There is our redress," he continued, kicking the roll tossed back on the leaves. "All that ever came back. The rest he might as well have devoured. No wonder they called him werewolf." "I've heard him accused of almost everything," remarked the professor incredulously, "but never of that." "It was suppressed in print through family influence. Nevertheless, it is a fact. He was brought to trial for it in Temeshvar in 1753. What they proved, I never heard. But for the superstition, it is one of those horrible survivals of the Middle Ages, which, it seems, cannot be rooted out. No matter. I mention it showing the popular opinion of the man, if he was a man, and not a monster." The professor took a final look at the book pile, and then, commenting on the form rather than the contents of the ledgers, which as extended rolls, coulandri, and not foliated volumes, had survived into comparatively recent times, asked to buy one as a curiosity. "Buy them all!" exclaimed the priest. "They are of no use here." The disappointed visitor pulled the spurned roll out of the leaves and dusted it off with his handkerchief. "This will do," he said, whereupon, after paying the moderate sum demanded, he followed his venerable guide out of the room and upon a brief tour of inspection through the great building. But before they reached the lower floor, he had regretted his purchase. The clumsy bundle, nearly 2 feet long, about 8 inches thick, and very heavy, seemed a useless encumbrance, and he was several times at the point of leaving it behind him. But at last, when the horses were brought up, managed to make it portable by tying it to the back of the saddle. Then, after a grateful farewell to the monks and their obliging superior, and without waiting for the midday meal, he rode off with his peasant guide. Yalach was the last monastery on the professor's itinerary, But the more he reflected upon his visit there, the more disgusted he became with his summer's search for treasures that had existed only in his imagination. Yalloch again proved the fact, for if Trenck had taken all the books in the days of its glory, why had no scholars heard of valuable manuscripts in the inventories made during his celebrated lawsuit with the Crown? Above all, a book of immense value bound in gold, coveted by the marauder and hidden by the monks? What had become of it after Trenck's death? The abbot's story was probably a myth, which the professor might well banish from his mind, and with it his plan of pushing his fruitless search down the river into Bulgaria. The evening breeze failed to refresh him. In gloomy meditation he watched the pink of ending day fade from the eastern sky, while the meadows gave up their golden green to long, stalking shadows from the swaying acacia trees. The thoroughbred horses hurried their riders northward, but the sun was setting by the time the professor had reached Smendria, paid off his mounted guide at the hotel, and found his way to the houseboat. 2. His servant, a powerful sunburned, flaxen-haired young fellow, with eyes as blue as his fresh shirt, had been taking down the deck awning for the night, when a dejected scholar crossed the floor of a dilapidated boathouse and stepped on board. "Everything went all right, I hope, sir, while you were gone?" remarked the young man, as he took the master's dusty coat. "About as usual," answered the latter gloomily. "I found nothing." "Well enough, sir. It is no worse. But I've had a very queer dream about you." The professor tried to smile. "Nothing very cheerful, I suppose," he said. "I can't say that it was. That is, the last part of it. I dreamed that one night you had caught a very beautiful kind of insect, like a glowworm, the brightest I ever saw. While you were studying it, a woman dressed in red came to look at it. All at once she snatched it from your hands. Then, when you tried to get it back, she turned into a wolf and began to eat you up. The dream came back a second time." "I'm glad I escaped the woman, or the wolf, whichever it was," remarked the professor. "The glowworm I will always miss. This good-for-nothing book," laying his hand on the bundle that he had brought with him, "is what you call a farm ledger. It ends my list of failures. I have had enough of them. Sell the boat at once, and we will take our passage on the next upgoing river steamer." He tossed the despised bundle upon the cabin roof, and was about to give further directions for packing, when the young man surprised him with the news that, owing to a proposed blasting in the channel below them, the river navigation had been suspended during his absence, and the last steamer had left that afternoon. As no railway existed in those days, the information, which completely cut off his easy return home, confounded and provoked him. He waited a while to hear the man confirm it, then picked up his package, crossed the roof, descended into his cabin, and lay down on the berth, determined to dismiss the disagreeable subject from his mind until after supper. But, tired and hungry as he was, his vagrant thoughts, contending with the new difficulty, had half mastered him when, by way of a possible diversion, after glancing contemptuously at the bundle on the chair, he got up and unwrapped it. No last flicker of sunlight lit the shadows in the cabin. No sound broke the stillness as he laid it on the bed and began slowly unrolling it. The scroll, owing to the stiffness of the leather, opened with difficulty. Holding it down on the coverlet, the scholar rolled and unrolled the ends until he had reached about a fifth or sixth revolution, when a long waxed bundle, exposing a deep-cut cavity in the interior, slipped out on the bed and fell on the floor. He picked it up. It was heavy, compact, and tightly bound with what seemed to be a sheet of linen covered with beeswax. Carefully inserting the point of his knife through the envelope, he slowly removed this, when, to his astonishment, a second cylindrical manuscript, or coulandros, rolled like the first, appeared. It was tied together with two thongs, wrapped upon ornamented buttons or discs, apparently made of gold. The well-preserved leather, light gray in color, was richly embossed on its outside and opened easily until, after about 2 revolutions, the professor's eyes caught the unfolding characters of a closely written text. Opposite this, the outer side of the roll showed a yellow surface of gilded felt or wool, under a magnificent fretwork of gold beads embroidered with blue and sparkling stones that seemed to glow with a self-contained light. Trembling with excitement, he lifted the thing from the bed and was about to carry it outside for better inspection when he heard voices and shuffling feet, followed by the familiar tramp overhead. "What shall we do, Herr Professor?" whispered Karl a moment later, leaning forward into the cabin. "The customs officers are here, 2 of them." Hastily rolling up his manuscript, the startled traveler thrust it under the mattress, pulling out his purse, and handed several Austrian banknotes to his servant. "Get rid of them," he ordered. "I have found something here that they must not see." Then, with a wink and a significant squirm of thumb and fingers, the man climbed up the ladder. The scholar sat down on the berth and listened to the sound of voices that followed. By the time the disquieting murmur ceased, it had grown dark, too dark to see his treasure trove as he pulled it from under the mattress. He got up and stepped across the cabin. When the boat was built, he had taken advantage of its doubled partitions to insert a closet behind a small cupboard in the interval. He turned a clothes hook, which released the cupboard, placed the manuscript upon a hidden shelf, and had closed the opening when the bell rang, and he went to supper. But he had lost his appetite for Vienna coffee and Kümmelbrot. Amazed, thrilled, confounded by the events of the last few moments, he hurried through the meal in silence, scarcely hearing the detail of Karl's mercenary transaction. At length, he suddenly realized the danger of a second visit from the officers, and rose from the table. "I have found your glowworm," he said. Mounting the ladder, he hurried off to his cabin, to return presently with the new treasure tied in paper. "We can't afford to run any risks with this thing," he declared, holding out the bundle in the twilight, while with suppressed emotion he astonished his servant with an account of its astounding discovery. "It must be soldered up in a tin, watertight case. We must leave here tonight." He walked down the gangplank and jumped ashore. The man followed him, and they went up the bank together, after which, with a few more words of explanation, he hurried away. The lights of Smendria were brightening, and the din of its nightlife waking on the river breeze, as the excited professor jostled the crowd among its torchlit booths and tunnel-like shops, till the clang of a hammer and anvil brought him to the place he looked for, a smoky labyrinth, lighted with several hanging oil lamps, where a half-naked tinsmith, working at a furnace, laid down his hammer to listen to the uncommon requirement. A promise of extra pay hurried the job, and within an hour the manuscript was safely enclosed in a watertight cylinder, soldered under a close-fitting lid. Hanging it as a satchel over his shoulder by a strap run through 2 attached rings, he thanked the man, paid his bill, and hastened back to the boat. A light in the kitchen, shining through its open door, showed Karl leaning forward upon the table, asleep upon his stool. The professor roused him, and, with his help, pulled in the gangplank and dragged the houseboat by its cable about 20 feet upstream. Then, on quickly lifting the anchor, a strong push with the boat hook and double pull at the oars and rudder swung the heavy craft out into the stream. No moon lit the great river as, swept out into the night, they watched the lights of the noisy city grow dim, and guided only by the star gleams, the shifting of shadows, and the rustle of ripples upon the forest wreckage, drifted on until about midnight. Then, with the sweep of branches over the deck, came the rattle of boat hook and anchor that brought them to rest under the bank of a wooded island. But for a long time the professor lay awake in his cool and comfortable cabin. The sinister figure of Trank, cheating himself of his booty, appeared and reappeared in his waking dreams. Vain theories, in variance with the abbot's tale, to account for the singular hiding place of the manuscript, doubts as to its magnificent embellishment, so imperfectly seen, regrets that he had sealed up his treasure, impulses to get up and file off its lid, banished rest until exhausted nature at last asserted itself, and he fell asleep. 3. Through the trees the sunbeams glanced on the cabin roof deck next morning as the professor sat by the breakfast table smoking a cigar. Carl, who had finished clearing away the dishes, stopped and looked a moment at his master. "Do you believe in dreams, sir?" he asked. The scholar had been gazing up through the fluttering leaves at the sky, across which floated white summer clouds of the familiar shape often compared to the fleeces of sheep. "What kind of dreams?" he returned. "We all have dreams." "That dream that I told you about yesterday in Smandria. I have had it again, sir. I don't like it at all." "About my finding a glowworm?" "Not so much the glowworm as the rest of it. The red woman who turns into a wolf and tries to eat you up." The professor laughed as the young man pushed the floating house out of its shadowed harbor. He rose from the table. "Here is your glowworm," he cried, laying his hand on the tin satchel suspended from his shoulder. Several days had passed. The Carpathians were rising to the eastward. The channel had narrowed to half its width as the current swept them towards the dangerous rapids that they proposed passing as usual, without pilot or chart. Seated on the gunwale one afternoon, with his hand upon the tin-sealed, still unopened treasure, the professor was looking anxiously down the river, listening for the warning roar of waters, as yet inaudible. Island after island, village after village, had faded into the background. The grotesque Parrot Rock had risen in mid-river and was disappearing, when, at sight of a vast ruin blending with the cliffs to the right, he seized the rudder and, hastily deciding to take advantage of its high skyline as a viewpoint around the sharp bend just ahead, with the help of a few oar strokes from Carl, brought the boat into slack water under the rocks. The castle of Golyabats had a bad name on account of an insect of obscure origin, known to naturalists as the murder fly, which in poisonous, deadly swarms issued from it about midsummer. But the professor, in answer to Carl's question, declared that they were a month ahead of the insect danger, and sprang ashore. Following the blasted wreckage of a once mighty wall, which skirted the rock for about 100 yards, and then turned uphill, he found a breach and clambered into a stony waste, beyond which the bleak monument of race-hatred and cruelty rose above the rock. The drawbridge was gone, but the double-winged doors of wood, which still mounted the gateway ahead, stood open. Passing these, a very steep path over ramparts wrecked by the Turks, and by way of several vaulted openings, which might have served as egresses for the murder fly, brought him at last to the top of the great keep, where the eagle's view, with its flash of impetuous river, brighter than the clouds, broke upon him. He took up his field glasses, swept them over the mountain panorama, and was about to focus them upon the doubtful waterway when, to his disagreeable surprise, he saw that he was not alone. In the shadow, near one of the towers, two white-skirted men were leaning against the wall, and beyond them he noticed a very abnormal-looking woman, hideously deformed in profile by a bristling mass of facial hair. But as he stared at her, and as she left her companions and approached him, the apparent beard changed to a grotesque mouth mask of coarse brown grass. Around a dingy red gown glittered a very conspicuous polished belt made of large metallic discs, mounted on strings of shells or teeth that jingled as she walked. She stopped and pointed to the professor's tin satchel. "Excuse me, my gentleman, it is for the murder fly." She tapped the pavement with her foot. "Come with me, sir. Gypsy woman will show you the murder fly." Her muffled words buzzed curiously under the mask, while the professor again raised the glasses to his eyes, and then, politely declining her services, walked toward one of the battlements. The woman followed him. "It is too soon," she mumbled. "When the murder fly comes out, the sky is black." She laid her hand on her mask. "We must not breathe him, my gentleman, when we go down into his house." Again, her foot tapped the pavement. The professor heard her words die into a hiss, while, as he crossed to the other side of the rampart, the jingling behind him proved that the woman was still dogging his footsteps. He turned about, and taking a silver gulden from his pocket, handed it to her. "Let me alone," he said sternly. "You are worse than the murder fly." Instantly her manner changed. She held the coin in her hand, looked at it a moment, and then, with a contemptuous shrug, tossed it over the precipice. "This is bad money," she hissed. "You are a cheat." Under her pink hooded handkerchief he could see a dangerous glitter in the greenish eyes as she shook her fist at him. Then, turning, she walked back to her companions and disappeared with them behind the wall. The incident was decidedly disagreeable, but the professor was too much preoccupied to concern himself long with it, and took time enough to make sure that the suspected rapids were not yet in sight. Descending as he had come, and without stopping to examine the much-discussed exits of the murder fly, he had last got to the base of the ruin. It was getting late by the time he reached the outer wall, and he had just passed the gateway when, at a startling rattle of stones, a rock struck the ground at his feet and rolled into the open space ahead. He looked up, but saw no one on the wall top. Then another rock, missing him by a few inches, bounded after the first. Suddenly realizing his danger, he started to run, while one heavy mass after another crashed past him down the hill, until, thinking he was beyond their reach, he stopped. Just as his hand grasped the tin can to make sure that it was safe, a heavy blow on the back of his head ended everything. He felt himself falling. Sensation and consciousness vanished. When he came to himself, he was lying, wounded and dazed, on the hillside. Carl was leaning over him, but for a time the scholar was unable to recall his surroundings, much less account for his condition to the astonished servant, who searched his pockets to find that his watch, field glasses, and pistol were safe. "And your tin box?" asked the young man. With a wild sweep of his hands over his coat, the professor felt that it was gone. He staggered to his feet, in the hope that the swinging package might have been broken from him in his fall, searched the surrounding stones and weeds. Carl lit several matches. In vain. "They have stolen your box," observed the young man as they groped down the hill in the twilight. "But why not your watch and your other things?" "3 of them, did you say, sir?" "2 men and a woman." "A woman," repeated the servant slowly, looking in astonishment at his master. "Was she dressed in red?" In spite of his condition, the professor laughed. "Boy, you had better get that infernal dream out of your head. The thing is bad enough as it is." 4. Following a restless night on the river shoals, several days at anchor above the rapids near Bavna, brought back the professor's strength, though not his spirits. For a long time the loss of his manuscript was too much for his philosophy. In vain he tried to console himself with the thought that, having so imperfectly seen his treasure, he might have exaggerated its value. But the doubt remained, and with it a vague foreboding of approaching danger, half felt among the rocks in his cabin, or seemingly muttered under the roar of waters. As the disaster ended his further need for river travel, he might have left the Danube at Ravna, had not the hope of disposing of his houseboat at one of the larger landing ports induced him, as he thought, for the last time to buckle on his life-preserver and steer into the rapids below Islas. St. Brankova, Dolbinanovosh, Tishkavika swept by. Then, after a long halt in the historic cliff shadows of Kazan, where the throttled river pauses for its final plunge, they hurried again into the bright light. Sunny meadows smiled, trees waved their welcome, ripples flashed as down the valley they sped, until early one afternoon their race was unexpectedly challenged in mid-river by some soldiers in a boat, waving a flag. "You are breaking the law, my friends," shouted one of them, a heavy, red-faced petty officer, who held the flag and was standing up. He pointed along the waterline toward the housetops of Orshava. "Don't you know that we are blasting over there? You are smugglers." "No, traveling for science," answered Carl. His boat slid along the gunwale, and the soldier stepped aboard with 2 of his men. Ordering one of them to take Carl's oar, he seized the rudder. The current was running like a mill race, but he knew how to steer, and holding the bow upriver, soon swung the houseboat skillfully along the side of a large moored barge, where a man caught it with a boat-hook. The barge was full of workmen, busy in adjusting a piece of machinery, and the soldier pilot, climbing aboard, stepped up to a tall, handsome man in the white uniform of an Austrian general, who was directing the work. The latter listened to him for a moment, and then came to the side of the barge. "A houseboat, it seems," he remarked, evidently impressed by the stately appearance of the scholar, who stood at the door of his cabin without a hat. "No cargo?" The professor declared his purpose. "But you must have heard that the river is closed for blasting." The challenged traveler apologized for his venture, took out a card, and handed it to his questioner, whose highly intelligent face brightened at the sight of the noted name. "Nothing is happening just now," he said, "but we must look out for you." An explanation followed in which the traveler inquired as to the possibilities of a boat sail at Orshava, while the chivalric engineer justified his rules as safeguards for commerce and against lawsuits. As they talked on, the professor soon found that in the directing mind of the great river project he had met a warm friend of science. "You must spend the night here," continued the hurried general, when, after several eager questions, the conversation was interrupted by an orderly. "In that case, dine with me, yes? At my headquarters, up the hill, yonder." He pointed to a grove of trees above the town, and naming the dinner hour, climbed down into another boat, which had meanwhile joined them, and was carried away amongst the barges. 5. Several hours passed, spent by the professor in examining the engineering works that had overwhelmed the little village of Orshava in those days. And it was late in the afternoon when he left his floating house, and after a hot walk up the mountainside, reached a many-pillared, dingy wooden building set upon a slope of a lawn under high trees. No fairer evening ever shone over the town and river. The birds were singing overhead. A mellow glow in the light mist seemed to gild the porch and a newly set dinner table, where, in the fresh white of his gold-faced uniform, the tall soldier met his guest. "Is the air too much here?" he asked. "If so, we will move inside." "By no means," cried the heated professor, looking around him up the hill at vistas of sky and cloud framed in green. "You have the ideal background, the indescribable plus ultra, orchestra included. Just listen to the nightingales." "Yes," said the general, "the lay of the land is very attractive. A broken-down hotel, with an old pleasure ground, now a sort of bird's paradise. There is a stream beyond there, that you don't see. I came upon it by chance. I am here very little, except at night, when, as you notice, I am alone and depend upon guests like yourself." As they waited, two white-gloved soldiers hurried to and from the table, while the conversation, introduced by the host's hasty sketch of the great engineering work under his supervision and the difficulties of blasting in the rapids below, soon turned to the unfortunate literary expedition of the professor. "It hardly seems like a common robbery," observed the general, while listening to the description of the thieves at Gulabanks. "The gypsy woman with the mask gives it an odd look, but as long as the origin of the murder-fly remains uncertain, we shall have these dangerous impostors posing as guides. Besides which, the caves there, supposed to breed the insect, are known to contain gold, hence the gypsies, who are all gold hunters, as you know." These caves, he continued, had never been properly explored, notwithstanding their traces of mining operations by the Romans, thus fully accounting for the ancient celebrity of the neighborhood as a source of the precious metal. The fact was further established by certain local customs, such as the singular process of washing gold in sheepskins, described by Agricola, still practiced by the gypsies. As the tokay passed round the table and the candles flickered in their glass globes, the learned engineer declared that the Greeks in the narrative of Herodotus had first associated the surrounding mountains with the terrible and still surviving superstition of the werewolf, gave his reasons for believing, further, that the great historian had confused the country with ancient Colchis in Jason's classic search for the Golden Fleece. "But here," he said, "history fades into prehistoric darkness, myths, many of which we may discard as baseless fancies, while others, like that of Jason, still show their prototype." Some of these sheepskin trophies of the gold washers, he declared, were still encrusted with gold and were more absorbent than others. Some, he had seen, were so heavily gilded that they had become fetishes in the eyes of the superstitious peasants, who, fearing to remove the precious dust, buried them with the dead, or even burned them as votive offerings to the werewolf. He was about to continue, when the sudden appearance of an orderly interrupted him. He listened for a moment to the man, and then, with apologies, rose and followed him into the house. 6. The professor sat looking at the sparkling glasses and silver before him. Over long intervals of time, linked by mysterious events, his wandering thoughts, inspired by the general's conversation, soon returned to earth. From Jason and the Golden Fleece, Colchis and the sorcerers of Herodotus, to the werewolf of modern times, unconscious comparison had exaggerated his own failure. He helped himself to the delicious Tokay, but in spite of it, memories, tantalizing, distressing, vivid, of his defeated plans had got the better of him by the time the general returned. But the latter seemed preoccupied with some very pleasant thought as he stepped quickly up to the table, stopped, and stood a moment looking at his guest. Filling a glass, he lifted it to his lips. "Allow me to drink to your health, Professor," he said. "I have some news for you, almost too strange to be true." The professor rose. "Retribution on Earth, rare, you know, yet not altogether out of the question." The general paused, and the professor, little suspecting what was to come, looked inquiringly at the masterful face and the kindly gray eyes that sparkled with suppressed emotion. "Those rascals that robbed you, it seems, have not confined themselves to Gorobans, but have come here, breaking into one of our storehouses. Our sentinels fired on them, of course. One fellow met his end. Upon him they found—" The general paused again and rang a little table bell. "Something that you may perhaps recognize." As he pushed back some of the dishes, one of the waiters appeared with a tray, which he placed upon the table. The professor started in speechless astonishment when his eye caught the unmistakable form of his tin can, wrapped in its leather strap, lying upon a napkin. "The villains have opened it," said the general, "but examine it. Your treasure is safe." Overwhelmed, half frightened, the professor picked it up to see that the solder had been filed off around the edge of the lid. The brown bundle was in its place. He slowly pulled it out and removed the wax cover. No sign of disfiguration or injury marked the embroidered leather, as, with trembling hands, he unbuttoned its thongs and displayed the gorgeous scroll, only half seen in its former examination. Disregarding the exposed text, he rapidly unrolled the whole manuscript, and pushing aside the dishes, turned it upside down upon the table, where, like the wind-swept embers of a fire, it seemed to glimmer in shifting tints of red, yellow, and blue. The general leaned over it, touched it several times, and turned to one of the candles to examine his forefinger. "This is a very strange coincidence," he at length said. "A splendid piece of embroidery," declared the professor. "Yes, but do you realize that it is worked upon a sheepskin, if I am not mistaken, one of the fleeces of the gold washers? The gold has been fixed." The magnificent fretwork, outlined in minute beads of gold and blue stone or glass, interwoven with the sparkling threads, appeared to be wrought upon a background of luminous wool, in parallel designs, showing a series of human figures. The professor was overcome. He pointed to one of the larger of these. "There," he said. "If you have been in the catacombs of Rome, you must recognize the favorite emblem of the early Christians, the Good Shepherd, carrying the sheep." The general pulled out a small magnifying glass and held it close to the embroidery. "Pardon me," he objected. "The head is not human." He handed the professor the glass. "Look at it again. It is that of an animal, a wolf, or rather, a man with a wolf's head. We spoke of the devil, the werewolf. Here he is." He stepped back, while the professor again leaned forward and carefully examined the figure. I agree with you, he admitted at last. But what an outrageous freak of monkish decoration! Rather black magic, the general contended. The monks never made the thing. The sheep is a victim. Look at the children devoured by wolves. In the small medallions, they repeat the diabolical idea. The text should correspond. The professor turned the book over and for a long time examined it in silence. It consisted of isolated passages in several Balkan dialects, with illuminated designs at intervals, representing the sun, moon, stars, and the planet Mercury. Some of the texts were in rhyme, and some, partly decipherable, stood, he said, rather for exorcisms of an evil spirit than prayers, since the names of God, the Virgin Mary, or saints nowhere appeared. The work of a sorcerer, said the general, one of the wolf books, as the peasants call them. He left the table and began walking up and down the terrace. I have heard of these books, he continued, used by exorcists in connection with this infernal superstition, but I never until now saw one. To my mind, it would account for your robbery at Gulabats, at least according to the peasants, who would tell us that these gypsy thieves were wolfmen, and that they have smelt the book through your tin box. No wonder Trank wanted it, if he dabbled in this sort of thing. But why should the monks of Yolok preserve such an unholy relic? Asked the professor. On account of its magnificent cover. Some learned abbot, no doubt, recognized its value. As for Trank, with all his faults, he would have appreciated it under any circumstances. The wonder is that he let it slip through his fingers. As a werewolf, remarked the professor, laughing, he seems to have lost his gift of smell. The general enjoyed the joke. Then they sat down again. These coincidences are very remarkable, he said, after several moments of silence. 7. He was leaning upon the table, his gray eyes fixed steadily upon the magnificent scroll spread out before him. There is something else, he continued slowly, with hesitation. Another coincidence. I have not mentioned it before. I thought it rather too ghastly for the dinner table. He stopped to offer a cigar to the professor, and then taking one himself, proceeded. When the gypsy who carried this tin package of yours was shot, as I told you, a very strange thing is said to have happened. Too strange, in fact, to be believed. He paused again to light his cigar. Without parallel in this season of year, our storehouses on the other side of the mountain were attacked, they say, by wolves. There are large sheep enclosures attached, and it chanced that the day before the occurrence a little daughter of one of the shepherds died, and was laid out in a vacant stable near the gate of the stockade. The gate was open. There was plenty of noise, clatter among the sheep and howling. But when the sentinels fired in the dark at what they took to be wolves, they killed your man, as I told you, with his tin can hanging about his neck. One or more wolves, remember, so they say, escaped. But the shocking part of the story, he added, rising from his seat to blow out one of the guttering candles, rests on the evidence of the sentinels and an old woman, who arranged the child's shroud before the funeral next day. Consequently, it can't be proved without exhuming the body. The lamps around the little dead girl in the shed had blown out. When they came to relight them, they declared that one of the legs was missing, cut off, or bitten off, close to the hip. Your thief, therefore, according to them, was a werewolf. Yet the body was that of a man. Do you mean that these people would say that the wolf had regained its human form at the time of death? Precisely. I understood that the change was said to work in exactly the other way. It works both ways, according to these fanatics, depending on circumstances, charms, and so forth. The whole is hypnotic, if you will, a jumble of contradictions. But were it not so horrible and fatal, it would be ridiculous. But what I could not realize before is the association of this thing with your manuscript. What are we to make of that? Curious, of course, said the professor. But we leave out the doubtful mutilation of the little girl. I can't see anything supernatural about it. The man killed is one of the gypsies I met at Gullabouts. The others escaped. Why wolves? Why not dogs? The whole thing happened in the dark. Of course, it's a coincidence. Too many coincidences, objected the general, who, again walking up and down the terrace, denounced the hellish dementia, as he called it, which for centuries had fixed its fatal blight upon the surrounding region. Leave out the supernatural, he continued. These grave robberies, kidnappings, and domestic outrages that defy the law and the efforts of the church have never yet been explained. 9 times out of 10, there is no motive. The victims are children, whether by natural death, as in his case, or murder or infanticide. In other words, cannibalism in its most frightful form. Who proves these things? Asked the professor. The priests. They tell us of whole villages as sometimes depopulated of children. If they exaggerate, half of what they say would be terrible enough. As over the cigars they discussed the possibilities and theories of lycanthropy, the higher interpretation of the manuscript was forgotten, and the conversation, in spite of themselves, narrowed itself down to the details of the ghastly tale, which the general himself refused to believe. It had grown late. The Tokay stood untasted on the table, while associations more and more sinister gathered round the gorgeous object that glowed and flashed in the candlelight, until the professor, shrinking from the task of escaping from the country with such a thing in his possession, almost regretted that he had found it. To circumvent the latter difficulty, the general proposed a special passport under the seal of the International River Navigation Treaty, and the talk ended. 8. These dinners, exclaimed the hospitable soldier, with a touch of sadness in his sonorous voice, as he greeted the professor the next day. Friends made at night, and lost in the morning. I am afraid I am getting a little too old for that. He explained that the promised passport, lying on his writing table, though available at large river ports and at the Turkish frontier, would not be comprehended by country officials, nor by the truculent Romanian sentries. Then he conspicuously stamped it with the imperial seal. Jason's adventures were dangerous, he laughed, as the professor turned away. Keep clear of the peasants. If you take my advice, you will not land at any of the river villages. Again, the magic sweep of the current seemed to reverse the laws of motion, while, as if they stood still, it was the world that moved backward. The professor had recovered his spirits, standing on the cabin roof in his life-preserver, with his precious canister slung over his shoulder. He heard without fear the threatening roar of waters. The iron gates were open, and away they went, dancing, trembling, leaping, whirled from shore to shore, till by oar plunge and rudder sweep they had cleared the last reef and whirlpool. Then suddenly, unaccountably, just as they drifted into smooth water, the rudder broke. As the boat became at once unmanageable, several vexatious delays followed. but they soon found that their makeshift splicings of the highly efficient, enormous oar, balanced by a rope twist on the stern post, failed to ensure their safety when, in island channels, they contended with shoals, eddies, or the branches of submerged trees. The Carpathians were fading away to the westward, their foothills sinking into the great Dacian plain, where the Danube, broadening like a lake, seems to lose its current. Yampalanka and Jakavica had come and gone when, at last, the professor, compelled to disregard the general's warning for the sake of a thing obtainable at most river towns, worked carefully out of the main stream, and hugging the shore for about a mile, gained the village of Borobasa, just below several large moored barges. 9. The boat had grounded on a muddy beach, under overhanging acacia trees, where a few cows stood knee-deep in the shallow water. They heard the cackle of unseen chickens, and then the clang of an anvil, but saw no one till they had stepped ashore, when a gaunt, heavily built man in gray uniform and wearing a sword suddenly came out from behind the barges, and, seemingly surprised at the professor's explanation, led him up the beach into a wattled enclosure littered with boat wreckage. "Who told you to come here?" he asked, stopping to look at the stranger with a troubled gleam in his swollen eyes. "You can get oars at Kusiak, or Provo, or Rakowice. There's a fire feast here today. You know what for?" "No." The man paused at the faint howling noise from beyond the trees. "Do you hear that?" "I'm not afraid of dogs," laughed the professor, holding up his heavy walking stick. A frown crossed the haggard face of the man as he nodded his head contemptuously. "It's none of my business," he added. Then, pointing to a thatched shed, and leaving his puzzled hearer, he hurried off. "What did the man tell you?" asked an old blacksmith who was standing near a forge fire by the open shed door when the professor approached. "He said that I could get oars across the river." "So you can, but I can make oars too." "He warned me against your dogs." "Dogs? I have no dogs. He knows that." "Is he a customs officer?" asked the traveler. "Yes, poor devil, till they get rid of him. He is crazy." Learning that the job of finding and dressing the new rudder would take an hour or more, and having made his bargain with the old man, the professor stepped out of the smithy. By a vegetable garden, a gate led into a wide, shady lane, where a group of peasant laundresses, in Bulgarian village fashion, were at work around the public well, and as he went by, he stopped to notice that several of them were in holiday costume. One, a tall, athletic young woman, in a red embroidered jacket, had just manipulated the pole of the great well sweep, and without acknowledging the stranger's greeting, had swung 2 buckets of water upon her shoulder yoke, when her head-dress, a red cap, set sideways on her black hair braids, lost its pin or balance, and whirled off in the wind. As it fell and rolled near the professor's feet, he leapt forward, picked it up, took off his hat, and reaching it out to the approaching woman, placed her cap upon his head while, apparently more astonished than amused, the other laundresses looked on. He stepped backwards. The woman threw his hat contemptuously on the ground and followed his evasive retreat until at last he stopped, and with a polite bow returned her cap. She snatched it from his hand and stood a while looking angrily at him. Then, suddenly, to his amazement, The young Amazon sprung upon him, and seizing the tin box hanging upon his shoulder, wrenched it from its strap. The professor ran after her, caught the flying end of the broken strap, and with a quick jerk pulled the box out of her hands. The woman turned and again stared at him. Something inhuman gleamed in the green eyes, while a singular distortion of the mouth so disfigured the handsome face that the professor, repelled if not startled, turned away. His hat had rolled down the hill, and he had just found it and picked it up when he heard the voice of the blacksmith close by his side. The old man was speaking low. "Excuse me, my gentleman. You are a stranger, sir. Will you take a Hungarian man's advice?" "What is it?" asked the traveler, surprised at the question. "We are not in my country. I am from Semlin, but here, in Borobosa," he added with a whisper, "we let such a woman alone." "Is she married?" "God knows, but she is a very bad woman. Excuse me, my gentleman. It is not safe." The professor had followed the old man into his garden. "Turkish jealousy," he muttered. "More and more of it, I suppose, as we go eastward." His critic seemed anxious to say something else, but without waiting to hear what it was, the professor thanked him, left the garden through another gate, and by way of a narrow lane walked slowly up the hill. 10. Unlike the river villages thus far seen, the whole extent of Borobasa's huts, gardens, and lanes seemed buried in trees, a young forest, in which the scholar saw no sign of life, until the solitude began to astonish him. Then, at last, came a faint, resonant hum of voices, interrupted by the ringing of a bell. The cause of the noise was explained at the end of the lane, where, through an opening in the leaves, the sunlight caught the sheepskin caps and white shoulders of a dense crowd of men. They were sitting upon the ground, and, as the professor found on drawing near, along a narrow circular row of planks set with earthen bowls and dishes, he saw a black-robed Greek priest upon a platform, and opposite him, over the swarthy faces, a sheep garlanded with flowers, held close to the table by two crouching men. Fastened to the animal's horns, two burning candles, shielded by several extended hands, flickering in the draught. Presently the singing ceased. The priest raised his hands in prayer, and the approaching professor, with the uneasy feeling of being an intruder, took off his hat. He had stepped forward into the lane and was walking away then, at the touch of a hand softly laid upon his arm. He turned to look, with amazement, upon the woman he had offended at the well. "You will not go away," she said gently. The handsome face had lost all trace of anger as, with a laughing apology for what had happened, she held toward him a bunch of pink flowers. He took them, listened with surprise to her invitation to what she described as a public feast, and then followed her out of the lane into the crowded square. They had walked by the noisy table, where several of the peasants turned to look at them, when she laid her hand upon his tin box. "What do you carry in it?" she asked. "Flowers. I am a botanist." Passing a pile of faggots partially covered with black cloth, which he had not before noticed, he and his guide entered what he took to be a kitchen, a long thatched shed open in front and extending backward into a roofless bakery, in which several fires were burning, and where a group of peasants seated around a bowl of broth politely made room for him. The stranger sat down on a stool and took his turn with a wooden spoon at a highly seasoned stew, while the villagers, some of whom wore brightly colored vests and had the swarthy look of gypsies, examined his carved walking stick, and would have entertained him had they meddled less with his tin box, which he had again tied to its strap. They came and went, laughed and drank, until when several earthen wine bottles had been emptied one by one, they left him, and he found himself alone with a solemn, blue-eyed old peasant woman who had been stirring the soup. Her light, sun-bleached hair had begun to turn gray, and her brown mantle, open at the throat, showed a triple-strung necklace of red berries, knotted upon little silver coins. "Have you a saint for today?" he asked, as the woman, who held a rosary in her hand, laid it on the table. "For our holy Saint Basil," she said devoutly, "the friend of children. It is a fire feast." "What is that?" "You are a stranger, sir." She paused. "But you must know, we have no children here." "No children?" repeated the astonished visitor. "Where are your children?" With a strange expression, the woman looked at him a moment in silence. "What? Have you not heard?" she whispered. Then, glancing suddenly over her shoulder, she stopped. The other woman had come back, bringing a wine bottle, and, without sitting down, stood looking at them. Her peculiar greenish eyes had a slightly supercilious look as she turned them from the professor to his companion. "I have brought you some new wine," she said, placing the earthen bottle on the table and laying her hand on the old woman's shoulder. "To drink her health. Did she tell you who she is?" "No," replied the professor. "She is my grandmother." The old woman grasped her rosary and looked up, her face flushed with anger. She rose from her stool. "She tells you a lie," she said angrily. "I am no gypsy." While the indignant peasant walked away, the offender laughed mischievously and sat down at the table. "Why did you do that?" inquired the puzzled scholar. Without answering, the woman drew her stool nearer. "Did you show her your flowers?" "No." She laid her hand on the tin canister. "But you will show them to me, my friend?" "I have only roots," he said, "not flowers." Leaning forward, his companion clutched the tin box. Again he saw the threatening glitter in the green eyes. He started. For an instant, the masked gypsy at Gulabaz flashed upon his sight and vanished. "Let us see the roots," said she. He grasped her hand, pushed it away, and, following the example of the old woman, walked hastily off into the crowd. 11. In clouds of steam, among the hurrying cooks and waiters, the professor wandered a while. At length, noticing his late-aged companion near the entrance, he stopped. She was sitting on a bench with the customs officer he had met at the beach. The singular man, who was holding a white package on his knees and gesticulating violently as if in a rage, got up, thrust the bundle into his pocket, and walked away. The professor hesitated a moment, then sat down. "Why did you leave us?" he asked gently, looking into the still angry blue eyes. "You knew it was not my fault." "No, you are a stranger, sir. It is that gypsy woman." The old peasant pointed to the uncouth, haggard man who was standing outside near a woodpile. "Did you hear what he said about her?" "No." "Did you see what he was showing me in the handkerchief he carries about in his pocket?" "No." She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper. "It is his child's foot." "Good heavens! Is he crazy?" "Yes, Mary and Joseph. It would make you sick." Again she suddenly stopped. He looked up. The remarkable woman they talked about was standing before them. The professor was still holding her pink bouquet. "Are we friends?" she asked, pointing to the flowers with a laugh. "Come, I will show you my garden." Near the open window he caught the glow of her red cap and underdress. Her gold earrings sparkled in the sun. The professor would have risen, but the old woman clutched his arm. "Don't look at her," she whispered. "Come," urged the gypsy. Her green eyes, fixed upon him, seemed to expand with a dull whitish glitter and lose their pupils. "Don't look at her," repeated the old woman. With sudden anger at the continued arm clutch, the scholar felt an irrepressible impulse to break away. Just then a bell rang outside, and the gypsy glanced over her shoulder. "Come, I must go," she said. But as the professor sat still, she turned away, and waving her hand, walked quickly across the square. "I am afraid I have treated her badly," he muttered nervously, holding up his pink flowers. "She gave me these." "Throw them away. They will bring you bad luck." "What? The orpine? I thought it was a fortunate plant." "You will see, my friend. Do you know what she wants?" "No." "It is your tin box. Are you afraid of her?" Without answering, the professor tightened his grasp upon the canister. "I will tell you something." The old woman leaned toward him and again lowered her voice to a whisper. "She is a wolf woman." Once more the bell rang outside. "Get up here," urged the peasant, laying her hand on the bench. He mounted the seat. Over the heads of the crowd he saw the priest approaching the woodpile and draw away its black cloth cover, revealing the carcass of a grayish animal stretched upon the faggots. His companion pulled his sleeve. "Do you see him?" she whispered. "I see a dog or a wolf." She crossed herself. "It is a man. You don't believe it? The town is full of them. When they burn him, others will go away." The crowd of peasants gathered close, and the priest held up a book and began to read aloud in Greek. Gradually his resonant voice rose high and clear in passionate declamation. The men had removed their sheepskin caps and stood in silence, while a low crackling noise was presently followed by a cloud of whirling smoke. The wood-pile was on fire. As the smoke drew into the kitchen, a deep unison of many voices, blending with the tones of the priest, swelled into a hymn. Louder and louder, rising and falling in long refrains, it seemed to jingle in vibrations upon the beams of the shed. Fluttering tongues of flame shot into the sky over the heads of the choir. Cooks came out of the bakery and crowded the entrance, while the professor got down and walked outside to stare at the dramatic scene. When the fire had died into embers, the chanting ceased. The peasants sat down again, and the stranger stepped into the shed to find his companion, but she had gone. He walked into the bakery, then came back, to look in vain for her in the crowd. It was getting late. High time to return to the boat, he thought, as he slowly passed the smoky square, and then, with a last look at the noisy company and a bow to the priest, left the place. 12. Following by guesswork the direction of his former path, the professor slowly made his way down the hill. Wild, half-considered memory of the general's dinner and midnight talk at Orsova crowded upon him, but he had drunk too much for serious reflection. When a curious feeling that something was wrong with his surroundings yielded to drowsiness, he was crossing an open knoll by a deserted hut overlooking the river. There he saw a bench sheltered under the thatch, sat down upon it, and leaned against the wall. Moments passed as he looked outward upon the evening lights that streamed across the tree-tops and inward beyond the borderland of dreams. The place seemed confused with things astonishing, contradictory, casual, human feet floating in air, a cave lit by glowworms, an ash tree, the castle of Gulabans, a face framed in the ruins, now laughing, now frowning. He felt a gentle strain upon his shoulder that gradually increased to a pull, and awoke to find himself clutching the strap of his tin box. A woman was seated close by him on the bench, at first blending with the dream, her head quickly sharpened upon the background until he recognized his gypsy companion. "It is late, my gentleman," she said, leaning toward him. "You will not sleep here?" "No," he replied, rising. "I am going to the river." "I will show you the river." As he walked away, she joined him. "Have you forgotten your flowers?" she asked, pointing to the pink bouquet lying on the bench. "Let them go," he said. "I am told they will bring me bad luck." Again the angry glitter in the gypsy's eyes. "Yes," she sneered. "What else did the old fool tell you?" "She was telling me about Saint Basil." "And miracles. Do you believe in miracles?" The professor pointed to the darkening sky. "I believe in that. No beginning, no end. What are miracles to that?" The answer seemed to suppress his companion, who walked beside him in silence, while, heedless of the strong misgiving, he went on. The wine was in his head. With the fall of night, the unending lanes seemed to turn in the wrong direction, rather uphill than down, until he began to suspect that his guide, who had lagged behind, was misleading him. They had passed a gate in a wattled fence, beyond which the walls of a house glimmered faintly through the trees. He noticed the perfume of flowers. "It is very dark here," he said. "What's that?" He stopped suddenly at the sight of a large animal seen for an instant in the twilight upon the path ahead of him. The words brought no answer. He turned around. The woman was gone. He listened, then called, half startled at the sound of his own voice. The dark openings in the trees gave no sign, while as he felt again the curious sensation, as if his surroundings were slipping away from him, or did not exist, a heavy concussion upon his back sent him staggering forward. With a sharp, quick pain in his shoulder came a loud report close to him. The weight fell away, and he turned upon the officer he had seen on the beach. The man's face was distorted with rage. He was pointing with a pistol toward the house, and the professor looked back, but saw nothing. He was fumbling with his coat. "I've been robbed," he cried. Out of breath and muttering curses, the officer pushed his weapon into a belt mounted with pistols and pulled out another. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No, but there was a woman here. I had a satchel." "Do you want it?" "Yes." "Come on, then, if you are not afraid." They hurried through the gate, along a path, to a white-thatched building with open windows set with flowers. and past a closed door. Beyond this, another door stood ajar. Listening and hearing no noise, the officer cocked his pistol and pushed it open. A close, sickening smell met them as they entered a room faintly lit by a fading window light and a grease lamp flickering on a shelf. They saw a garret, a step-ladder, some kettles on a bench, and around the walls, or hanging from the rafters, dark masses of clothing and shoes. Some of the shoes were of child's size. The professor had just noticed a miniature row set on a table near one of the windows, when the officer, who was ahead, suddenly stopped at a guttural sound from the corner of the room. His eyes were fixed upon partly closed door to the left of the staircase, when the sound came again, more distinctly, a low, long protracted growl. He lifted his double-barreled pistol, but the door stood motionless. He walked forward and pushed it with his foot. With a loud creak, it swung inward, and the men started back at the sight of two lustrous points of light staring at them from the darkness. The officer fired, paused a moment, and then sprang through the doorway. There was a muffled rustling from beyond the opening, a flash, and a second report. The professor picked up the lamp and came to the threshold of a smoky, windowless closet, like a kitchen. He saw a high pile of faggots, near which the officer had stopped. He was leaning forward and presently began tossing aside a litter of loose sticks and bundles that scattered the floor, until, over the hearth of the dead fire, the unsteady gleams revealed a pool of blood, then the clawed feet, legs, and hairy body of an animal. "Hand me the lamp," said the man, and taking it, he stooped and held it close to the bloody head and glittering jaws of a wolf. "Now you know what that woman is," he exclaimed savagely. "You saw her." "I don't know what I saw," muttered the professor. "Good God, what is that?" From outside the house, a moaning cry, rising to a shriek, with quavering wails, slowly died away in an answering chorus of distant howlings. "Come, quick!" cried the officer. He turned towards the door, and the professor stepped away from the place, when, at a half-concealed glitter on the floor, he sprang backward. "For God's sake, bring the lamp!" He had stooped to seize a partly unrolled fleece of his manuscript, and was holding it with both hands. "Thank heaven!" came his breathless words, turning it about in the approaching light. While the officer muttered something inaudibly, he rolled it up and followed his companion to the outer room. When he had thrust his recovered treasure into his pocket, the two men hurried out into the twilight. As if possessed by a frenzy, the officer, who seemed to have forgotten his surroundings, went on talking to himself. Once they stopped at a rattle of bushes behind a fence, then hastened on, and a few moments later had reached the lane corner, where the crazed fanatic, refusing to listen to the professor's grateful offers, abruptly left him. The professor started to run. Down the steep hill he stumbled and sprang in the gathering darkness until, reaching an opening ahead, the scene seemed to shift suddenly into a place already familiar, a fading of fences and trees into the great well sweep, with the Smith's garden beyond. He stopped at the clutch of a hand on his arm. "Thank God it's not true," came Carl's frightened voice. "The blacksmith told me they had murdered you." Faintly seen down the hill, the old Hungarian was beckoning violently from his gate, while from the trees beyond them echoed the wild din of shouts and howlings. They reached the garden at a run and got into the smithy, followed by the old man, who, pushing them through the rear door of the shed, closed it behind them. "He said there was a woman following you. Did you see her?" asked the trembling, breathless servant, as they stopped on the beach to look back. The blacksmith had opened the door. He was waving his arms, and again they heard his shout, "Quick!" Get away, quick! A moment later, reaching the houseboat, they dragged the anchor out of the mud and, leaving the gangplank behind, pushed off. Before they had stopped rowing in the current, the tree outlines had vanished against the yet glowing horizon. For a long time, wailing echoes rising on the night wind from no fixed direction seemed to follow them in the sky. At last, these sounds died away, and as the great river, bending to the southward, bore them on, nothing but the murmur of ripples broke the silence, until a swollen eddy drew them into one of the channels of a group of islands. The young moon had set. Seizing a bough that swept by in the starlight, they found rest and safety at last in the secluded tangle of an island forest. 13. With the professor's safe arrival at Vidin 2 days later, our available sources of information end. His own posthumous notes, if ever published, must account for the later history of the great manuscript. Apart from its fame, established at Geneva and afterwards at Stockholm, it has often been said that the ill luck that clouded its discovery clung to it to the last. The scholars' conscientious scruples as to recompensing the monks at Hjalach were thwarted by the death of the abbot and by another insurrection in Hungary, and it is well known that several persons died or were injured while in possession of the treasure. Science was robbed of it when the ship, bringing it from Danzig to Copenhagen, foundered in a storm.